Welcome to the Velvet Myth. My name is Adam, and it's so lovely to have your company. Thanks for tuning in. It's my great privilege to be the voice that you listen to as you go to sleep tonight. I do hope you enjoy listening as much as I enjoyed recording all of these stories. And I'd really love for all of you, our wonderful community, to let me know if you like the stories that I've prepared. So, when you wake up tomorrow morning, it would mean a lot if you could pop back here and leave a comment of gratitude for me. Now, before we get started, make sure you're lying comfortably. Relax your shoulders, your jaw, your whole body, and enjoy a couple of deep, soothing breaths, drawing the air in and gently releasing it back out. Now you can simply relax and listen along for as much time as you like, knowing you can drift off whenever you are ready. So, let's begin. It's a drizzly morning in midsummer. Nora Calloway stepped through the front door of the hearth, the brass key turning with its familiar click against the steady drum of rain. She moved through the bakery with practiced steps, her bare feet silent on the worn floorboards, and reached for the row of switches beside the old brick archway. One by one, the warm lights came on, an Edison bulb above the prep table, the low lamp over the mixing station, the gentle glow that spilled across the leaded windows and made the raindrops outside look like scattered beads of amber. Rain tapped steadily against the glass as Nora tied her faded sage-green apron at her waist and crossed to the wooden counter. She measured flour into the great ceramic bowl, the soft sift of it settling like fresh snow. Then added the yeast, the sugar, the pinch of salt. Her strong hands worked the dough with quiet rhythm, folding and pressing while the scent of cinnamon from yesterday's batch still lingered in the air. Outside, the town of Maplewood Hollow remained hushed, its cobblestone streets blurred and empty under the summer downpour. Nora paused to wipe her palms on her apron and glanced toward the back wall. The damp patch had spread again overnight, a faint grey bloom across the plaster just above the baseboard. She studied it for a long moment, the rain's steady sound filling the silence, then decided she would not wait any longer. Setting the covered bowl aside to proof, she fetched the small pry bar from the shelf beneath the sink and returned to the wall. The plaster gave with a soft crack under the first careful pressure. Nora worked slowly, easing away loosened pieces that fell in dry curls around her feet. A larger chunk broke free and dropped, revealing a narrow cavity between the bricks where the mortar had long ago crumbled away. Something shifted inside that dark space. A small tin box wrapped in yellowed newspaper slid forward and landed in her open hands with a muted clink. Nora carried the box to the prep table and set it down beneath the swaying bulb. She brushed the dust from its surface with the corner of her apron, revealing a faded pattern of roses stamped into the metal. The lid resisted for a moment, then lifted with a faint metallic sigh. Inside, 9 envelopes lay neatly stacked, bound together by a single length of faded blue ribbon. Each one bore the same careful handwriting in dark ink, each addressed to Clara Voss. Nora lifted the bundle and turned it gently in the light. The paper felt fragile beneath her fingertips, the edges softened by time. Rain continued its quiet conversation with the windows while the cinnamon-scented dough rested nearby, and the bakery seemed to hold its breath around her. She loosened the ribbon with careful fingers, letting the letters rest in a small fan across the wooden surface. One envelope had slipped slightly askew, its corner revealing a date written in the same steady hand. 1962. For a long moment, Nora stood motionless, the warmth of the oven at her back and the cool breath of rain drifting in from the half-open door. The letters waited, their sealed edges catching the light like small, unopened doors. She reached out and touched the topmost envelope, tracing the name Clara Voss with one flour-dusted fingertip, and felt the first quiet stir of curiosity settle beneath her ribs. Nora placed the bundle of letters in the far corner of the work table and turned back to the dough that still needed its final shaping. She told herself the tin box and its contents could rest undisturbed until the morning's tasks were finished. But curiosity was a luxury best saved for later, when the rain might have eased and customers might have arrived. The proofing bowls waited beneath their linen covers, and she lifted each one in turn to check the rise, her fingers pressing gently into the soft surface before she moved on to measure fresh yeast for the next batch. Nora filled the kettle and set it on the small gas ring behind the counter, the familiar scrape of metal against tile grounding her in the present. Outside, rain traced slow paths down the leaded glass, blurring the cobblestone street into a wash of grey and green. The bakery remained empty, as it often did on such mornings, the only sound the low hum of the oven and the occasional creak of the old wooden beams overhead. She glanced once toward the blue ribbon lying across the envelopes, then looked away, reaching instead for the tin of loose-leaf tea that had belonged to her great-aunt. Nora poured the steaming water over the leaves and let them steep while she returned to the work table. The first tray of rolls had been set aside to proof, and she wiped her hands on her apron, the scent of cinnamon and browned butter still lingering in the warm air. Yet each time she passed the corner of the table, her eyes drifted back to the letters, the neat stack of them, drawing her attention the way a half-finished melody might linger in the mind. She carried her cup of tea to the stool beside the table and sat down, intending only to rest for a moment before the next step of the baking. Nora reached for the ribbon. Her fingers worked at the knot with the same careful attention she gave to folding pastry, and the silk slipped free without resistance. She set the ribbon aside and lifted the top envelope, breaking the seal with the tip of a paring knife. The paper inside was cream-coloured and slightly brittle at the edges, the handwriting steady and precise. The letter began with an ordinary greeting to Clara Voss, then moved into a description of an afternoon spent shelving books at the shop where Edmund Ashby worked. He wrote of noticing how she always chose the same corner table near the window, how she left small annotations in the margins of the novels she borrowed, and how he had started choosing titles he thought she might enjoy before placing them where she would find them. The affection in the words was quiet, never stated outright, but present in the way he described the light on her hair or the sound of her laughter when she discovered a passage that pleased her. He ended by saying he had written the letter instead of speaking the same thoughts aloud, because some things felt safer on paper. Nora set the first letter down and reached for the second without pausing to consider the choice. This one was longer, dated a few weeks later, and carried the same careful tone, but with an added thread of self-deprecation. Edmund recounted a rainy evening, much like the present one, when he had nearly invited Clara Voss to walk with him after the shop closed, but had instead offered her an umbrella and watched her leave alone. He confessed that he kept these letters in a tin box because speaking the words might change something he was not ready to lose. The vulnerability in that admission made Nora shift on the stool, her tea cooling unnoticed beside her. She slid from the stool to the floor, settling with her back against the warm oven door, and opened the third letter. The handwriting remained neat, yet the sentences grew slightly longer, more unguarded. Edmund wrote of wishing he possessed the courage to send even one of these pages, of fearing that honesty might cost him the easy friendship they shared. He described Clara Voss's hands as she turned book pages, and wondered aloud on paper whether she ever thought of him when she was not in the shop. Nora read slowly, the words settling into the quiet space between the rain and the oven's steady warmth. The dough in its covered bowls continued to rise, the surface pressing higher against the linen than Nora had planned. Her tea sat untouched, the surface gone still and cool. She reached for the fourth envelope almost without deciding to do so, already anticipating the next glimpse into the life Edmund had kept folded away. The letters no longer felt like objects discovered by chance. They felt like a conversation she had walked into midway, one she could not now bring herself to leave. Nora drew her knees up and continued reading, the bakery around her fading into the background as Edmund's careful voice drew her further into the story he had never sent. Nora remained on the flour-dusted floor a moment longer, the fourth letter still open in her hands, before the soft chime of the bakery bell pulled her back into the present. She rose quickly, brushing crumbs from her sage-green apron, and moved toward the front counter, just as May stepped inside, shaking rain from the shoulders of her lavender wool coat. May closed the door behind her, with the careful precision of someone who had performed the same motion for decades. Water droplets clung to the brim of her small hat, and she carried the faint scent of wet wool and the town's early morning chill into the warm bakery air. Nora gathered the remaining envelopes into a loose stack, sliding them behind the register, but not before May's pale blue eyes caught the name written across the topmost letter. Clara Voss. May went still, one gloved hand resting on the edge of the counter. The quiet that followed was not empty. It held the weight of recognition, as though a long-held breath had finally found its moment to leave her chest. "Where did you find those, Nora?" May asked, her voice low and even. Nora hesitated only a moment before answering. She described the damp patch in the back wall, the decision to pull away the loosened plaster, and the tin box that had come free with it. 9 sealed letters, she explained, all addressed to Clara in the same careful hand. She had meant only to set them aside, yet the rain and the proofing dough had kept her there, reading. May removed her cream gloves one finger at a time, folding them neatly over her handbag. She studied the stack on the counter as though confirming each envelope was exactly as she remembered. "I knew them both," May said at last. "Edmund Ashby and Clara Voss. They were part of this town long before you arrived." She accepted the usual cup of tea Nora poured and the cinnamon roll still warm from the second batch, but she did not lift either to her lips. Instead, she drew out one of the small wooden stools and sat, her posture upright even in stillness. Rain tapped steadily against the leaded glass behind her, softening the edges of the street outside until the world beyond the bakery seemed distant and unreal. Nora watched the old woman's face, noting the faint shift in expression that spoke of memories surfacing rather than being summoned. The letters no longer felt like a private discovery hidden inside plaster. They belonged now to living recollection, to someone who had walked the same cobblestones when the ink on those pages was still fresh. "Should I keep reading?" Nora asked, her voice quieter than she intended. May nodded once, the movement small and deliberate. "Yes," she said. "You should." The word settled between them, with the same gentle gravity as the rain against the windows, and Nora felt the bakery shift around her, no longer simply her own workspace, but a place where past and present had begun to meet. Nora reached for the next letter in the bundle, her fingers brushing the brittle edge of the envelope before she eased it open. She carried it to the work table, where a bowl of risen dough waited, and she began to shape the soft rounds into cinnamon rolls, while her voice filled the quiet space between the rain and the oven's low hum. Edmund's words emerged slowly, each line describing the way Clara had stood at the counter of the old bakery, her hands dusted with flour as she arranged loaves for the morning. He wrote of how he lingered near the doorway, with a book tucked beneath his arm, watching the light catch on the strands of her hair, and noticing the precise way she tucked a stray lock behind her ear. He described the scent of browned butter that clung to her sleeves, and the small, private smile she offered customers. Yet he never wrote the sentence that might have changed the afternoon. May sat on the stool beside the counter, her gloved hands folded over her handbag, and she listened, without interrupting, until Nora paused to dust the tray with sugar. May then spoke of how Clara had once helped at the hearth when Nora's great-aunt still owned it, arriving early on Tuesdays to sweep the front step and staying late to learn the recipe for the spiced loaves that drew the whole town. Edmund would stop by on those same mornings, May recalled, always with 2 or 3 volumes stacked under one elbow, always intending to ask Clara Voss something more than the weather or the price of a loaf. He never stayed as long as he wanted, May Linden said, because the words he carried never quite found their way past ordinary talk. Nora pressed the final roll into place and slid the tray onto the rack. The realization settled over her that Edmund must have chosen the bakery wall because it was one of the few places where Clara had left her own mark on the day. The bricks still held the warmth of those mornings when she had stood in the same spot Nora now occupied, and the letters had been meant to remain near that memory, even if they could not be sent. As the oven door closed and the rain tapped steadily against the leaded glass, Nora pictured a younger Edmund stepping through the doorway with his coat collar turned up, his eyes following Clara Voss as she moved between the flour sacks and the cooling racks. She pictured Clara glancing toward him once, the same quiet attention in her face that Edmund had never quite trusted himself to answer. May's voice softened as she added that something had shifted in the spring of 1963, a change that pulled both of them away from the bakery before the story they carried between them could find its ending. The words lingered in the warm air above the proofing dough, and Nora felt the ache of what had been left unsaid settle beside the steady rhythm of the rain. Nora reached for the next bundle of letters on the counter, her fingers still dusted with flour from the morning's work. The rain had thickened into a steady drumming against the leaded glass, each drop striking with enough force to blur the view of the empty street outside. She untied the faded ribbon with care, the paper crackling softly as she drew out the first envelope. Edmund's handwriting had grown tighter in these middle letters, the lines pressed deeper into the page, as if he were hurrying to catch thoughts that might slip away. Nora read of snow that had arrived early that December, blanketing the bakery steps and muffling the sound of Clara's footsteps when she came in for her usual loaf. Edmund wrote of standing at the back door with his coat still buttoned, rehearsing words he never spoke. He described the way the cold crept under the doorframe, and how he told himself there would be another morning, another chance, when the weather eased. The fear he named most plainly was simple. One honest sentence, might cost him the quiet hours they already shared, the friendship that felt safer than any risk of asking for more. May watched from her seat near the proofing cabinet, her gloved hands resting on her handbag. She waited until Nora had finished the second letter before speaking. Edmund had meant to retrieve the tin after only a few weeks, May said. He had written that the hiding place was temporary, a way to keep the words close until he found the courage to hand them to Clara himself. The plan sat in the letter like a promise he still believed he could keep. Nora looked up. The question formed before she could soften it. She asked whether Edmund had told Clara he was leaving. May's expression did not change, though her voice grew quieter. A telegram had come from his family late one afternoon, she explained, calling him home to care for his father. No one had expected the illness to move so quickly, and Edmund had boarded the evening train with only the clothes he wore. He had not found time to reach Clara, and afterward the days had folded into one another until the chance to explain felt lost. The sugar Nora had set to caramelize for the next batch of rolls caught at the edge of the pan. A thin line of darker scent rose, sharp against the cinnamon already in the air. She turned the burner off at once and scraped the browned portion into the sink, then laughed once, a small sound that carried no real amusement. The mistake felt fitting somehow. Another small thing left unattended while the past pulled her attention away. May continued without hurry. Edmund had never returned to Maplewood Hollow after that winter. The letters stayed where he had placed them, and Clara had gone on with her days at the bakery until she too moved on. Nora listened while the rain pressed harder against the windows. She thought of the single line Edmund had written about snow still falling outside his window the night he sealed the last of these middle letters. How he had closed the envelope, believing there would still be time to choose differently. The kitchen felt smaller with the weight of that belief, the possibility that a single day's interruption had carried the rest of the story out of reach. Nora folded the letter closed and set it gently beside the others, her hands still for a long moment before she reached for the next. Nora held the folded letter a moment longer than necessary, her thumb tracing the brittle edge where the ink had begun to fade. The kitchen around her remained hushed, the only movement the slow rise of steam from the proofing tray she had forgotten to turn. May watched her from the stool by the counter, her gloved hands resting one atop the other, the garnet brooch catching the low light each time she drew a careful breath. After a long pause, May spoke. She was waiting for him to speak first, she said. Clara never told him outright, but she waited every day after that last winter letter. She would finish her shift here at the bakery, wipe the counters twice over, and linger by the door, asking whether Edmund had come by while she was in the back. I saw it more than once. Nora set the letter down and turned fully towards me. The old woman's pale blue eyes held no mischief now, only a steady, sideways kindness. May continued, her voice low and even, as though she were handing over something fragile she had kept wrapped for decades. Clara left him a note, May said. She tucked it inside an old cookbook on the shelf above the mixing bowls, the one with a cracked spine that everyone reached for when they needed the rye bread recipe. She believed he would come back for it. The note said she loved him too, and that she would wait through Christmas if she knew he meant to return. She signed it with only her initial, the way he always signed his letters to her. Nora rose without thinking, her bare feet silent on the worn floorboards. She moved to the shelves that still lined the back wall, fingers brushing the spines of the remaining cookbooks, then the empty drawers beneath the counter, where flour scoops and rolling pins had once been kept. The motion felt instinctive, as though her hands might still find what Clara had hidden more than 60 years earlier. May did not stop her. She simply watched, the small weight of memory settling between them. "It is long gone," May said at last. "The cookbook went with Clara when she left town, and whatever was tucked inside it went too. I never saw the note myself, only heard her describe it the afternoon she placed it there. She trusted me with the secret, because she had no one else to tell. I have carried it since." Nora's hands stilled on the edge of the counter. The symmetry of the two hidden messages, one sealed inside the wall, one slipped between the pages of a book, pressed against her chest with a quiet, unexpected ache. Edmund had feared speaking too soon. Clara had feared speaking at all. Both had chosen the same bakery wall, the same small town, the same hope that time would offer another chance. And both had been left with only the rain against the glass and the knowledge that the chance had passed. May folded her gloves once more, the motion precise. "They loved each other," she said. "That much is certain now. What was never certain was whether either of them would ever know it." Nora returned to the letters spread across the counter. She did not reach for the next envelope. Instead, she stood with her palms flat against the wood, feeling the faint warmth that still rose from the oven below. The rain had eased to a softer rhythm, no longer urgent against the leaded panes, and the scent of cinnamon and browned butter had settled into the bricks themselves. For the first time since the tin box had come to light, Nora felt the weight of the story shift from something she had discovered to something she was now responsible for keeping. The certainty of mutual longing did not lessen the loss. It simply made the loss whole. She looked at May, whose face had grown still with the telling, and understood that the rest of the letters would have to be read with this new truth held carefully between them, like a second ribbon waiting to be untied. Nora settled onto the low stool beside the counter, the final bundle of letters resting in her lap, like something fragile and newly mended. The rain had softened to a lighter hush against the windows, a steady patter that no longer pressed for attention. May sat across from her, gloved hands folded, her pale blue eyes attentive but unhurried. Together they moved through the remaining envelopes, one by one, Edmund's careful script growing smaller and more urgent as the months of 1963 slipped away. In the last two letters, Edmund confessed everything he had held back for so long. He wrote of the afternoons he had spent watching Clara arrange flowers in the shop window across the street, of the words he practiced each evening only to swallow them again when morning came. He promised that when he returned from tending his mother's illness, he would come straight to the bakery wall, retrieve the tin, and place the letters in Clara's hands himself. The ink on that final page looked hurried, as though he had written it in the half-light before a train. Nora read the promise aloud, her voice low, and felt the words settle into the warm brick around them. May confirmed what the letters could not know. Edmund never reached Maplewood Hollow again. His mother's health had required him farther west, and by the time he was free to travel, Clara had already left to care for her own aunt in another state. The two had passed each other like ships in different seasons, neither ever learning the other had once stood in this same room and hidden a heart inside the wall. A pair of townspeople stepped inside for shelter and bought the last of the morning's cinnamon rolls, their brief laughter and the jingle of the doorbell pulling the room back into the present for a moment. When they left, silence returned, thicker and more companionable than before. Nora rose to wrap the remaining rolls in parchment, her fingers moving automatically while her gaze travelled over the flour-dusted counters, the single bulb still swaying, the old brick that now held more than damp. She realized she had treated the bakery as a place she was merely keeping in order, a duty inherited rather than a life she had chosen to inhabit. The discovery of the letters had not changed the building itself, yet something in the act of reading them had begun to shift the way the space felt against her skin. May watched her with the gentle mischief that sometimes surfaced even in serious moments. "Places become ours," she said, "when we let our hearts be seen inside them. Edmund and Clara never managed that step. You still can." A pair of townspeople stepped inside for shelter and bought the last of the morning's cinnamon rolls, their brief laughter and the jingle of the doorbell pulling the room back into the present for a moment. When they left, silence returned, thicker and more companionable than before. Nora rose to wrap the remaining rolls in parchment, her fingers moving automatically while her gaze travelled over the flour-dusted counters, the single bulb still swaying, the old brick that now held more than damp. She realized she had treated the bakery as a place she was merely keeping in order, a duty inherited rather than a life she had chosen to inhabit. The discovery of the letters had not changed the building itself, yet something in the act of reading them had begun to shift the way the space felt against her skin. May watched her with the gentle mischief that sometimes surfaced even in serious moments. "Places become ours," she said, "when we let our hearts be seen inside them. Edmund and Clara never managed that step. You still can." Nora tied the last string around the paper parcel and set it aside. Outside, the rain continued its softer rhythm, and the scent of browned butter lingered in the bricks, as though it had always belonged there. She placed her palms once more against the counter, no longer testing for warmth but simply resting, and felt the first quiet certainty that the bakery might, in time, become a home she had chosen rather than one she had found. Nora spread the 9 envelopes across the scrubbed maple counter in the order they had been written, their edges softened by time and the faint scent of cedar still clinging to the paper. She ran her fingertips along each one, smoothing the creases that decades of confinement had pressed into the corners, and felt the quiet weight of the decision settling between her and May. May leaned forward on her stool, the lavender wool of her coat brushing the edge of the counter, and pointed to the second envelope with one gloved finger. "That one came just after the first snow," she said. "Edmund mentioned the ice on the mill pond in the corner of the page. I remember Clara reading the newspaper aloud that week and pausing every time she reached the weather report, as though she hoped the words might carry some message she had missed." Together they worked through the small landmarks May could still recall. The week the town hall clock was repaired, the evening the flower stall sold its last dahlias, the morning the river rose high enough to reach the lower step of the footbridge. Nora wrote each detail on a narrow strip of parchment in her careful hand, slipping the notes between the letters so the sequence would remain clear without disturbing the original ink. When the last date was recorded, Nora stepped into the pantry and returned with a shallow wooden recipe box that had once held her great-aunt's handwritten cards. She lined the interior with fresh sheets of baking parchment and a folded linen tea towel the colour of cream, the fabric still carrying the faint warmth of the oven. The box sat open between them, like a small altar. Nora uncapped her pen again and wrote a single page in the same measured script she used for daily specials. It explained only that the letters had been found inside the wall, that they belonged to Edmund and Clara Voss, and that May had confirmed their voices. She added nothing of her own feelings, only the plain fact that the correspondence had remained unread for 60 years and now rested, by choice, at the hearth. May read the note once, then folded her hands over the garnet at her collar. "Let it stay between these walls," she said. Clara would not have wanted the town to turn their story into something to be whispered over market stalls. She kept her own heart quiet. We can do the same. Nora nodded. She gathered the letters one by one, placing each envelope inside the lined box with the care she gave to proofing dough, and set the explanatory page on top. The lid closed with a soft wooden click that seemed to draw the room closer around them. Outside, the rain had thinned to a silver mist against the glass, and the single bulb above the counter swayed once, then held steady. Nora set the box on the shelf above the flower tins where the morning light would reach it each day. The gesture felt small and final at once, an act of stewardship rather than rescue. May watched without speaking, the faint mischief in her eyes replaced by something steadier, and for the first time since the letters had surfaced, the bakery held no unanswered questions, only the measured breathing of two women who had chosen, together, to let the past rest where it could finally be seen. Nora slid the final tray from the oven as the last of the daylight thinned to a blue-grey hush beyond the windows. The cinnamon rolls gleamed under a thin veil of glaze, their scent rising in soft ribbons through the cooling bakery. May remained at the counter, her lavender coat already buttoned, yet neither woman moved to end the afternoon. Nora set one roll on a small plate between them. They ate without speaking, the pastry still warm enough to pull apart in quiet spirals. The rain had gentled to a distant tapping along the eaves, and the only other sound was the occasional creak of the old wooden floor settling after the day's warmth. When the last crumb had been brushed away, May drew on her cream gloves with deliberate care. "I am glad it was someone kind who found them," May said, her voice low and even. "They waited a long time to be read by the right person." At the door she paused, one hand on the latch. "Clara would have loved the smell of the bakery tonight," she added, and then she stepped into the mist and was gone. Nora turned the key and stood for a moment with her palm against the cool glass. The rooms behind her felt larger now, the counters cleared, the shelves ordered, the single bulb still glowing above the flower tins. She walked slowly through each space, touching the edge of the work table, the back of a chair, the frame of the doorway that led to the repaired wall. There the brick showed a narrow ledge where plaster had once hidden everything. Nora rested her fingertips against the rough surface and decided the recipe box belonged there, with room beside it for a single candle. She returned to the front window, pulled the stool close, and sat with her hands folded in her lap. Outside, water dripped from the awning in a measured rhythm that matched the cooling of the ovens. The bakery seemed to draw its own breath around her, the walls holding the day's warmth, the air still threaded with cinnamon. For the first time since she had inherited the keys, Nora felt no distance between herself and the place she stood inside. The story that had lived in the walls had found its ending, and the ending had left room for her own beginning.